3 weeks had passed since Xinyue opened her eyes in a life she thought she'd lost forever. 3 weeks of smiling at breakfast while she memorized every word her family let slip. 3 weeks of walking the same halls she'd once wept in, cataloging which maids reported to her mother, which driver reported to her father, which of Meichi's friends could be bribed with a single designer bag. 3 weeks of building a list. 7 names. She had written them in a notebook she kept hidden inside a hollowed-out book of poetry her grandfather had given her when she was 10, the one item in this house nobody else valued enough to touch. Lin Guowei. Wang Shufan. Lin Meichi. Uncle Lin Baoshan. Lawyer Han Deming. Zhao family fixer, name unknown. A 7th name she hadn't confirmed yet, someone inside Lin Holdings itself. She knew what they'd done. She had lived through the aftermath. What she didn't have, what she needed, was proof that would hold up somewhere colder and harder than her own memory. That was why she was standing outside a private meeting room on the 40th floor of the Hunyuan Tower, straightening the sleeve of a blazer she'd chosen specifically because it made her look older than 23. The name on the door read, Fu Jinghan, Jinghan Capital and Advisory. In her last life, she had heard this name only once, in passing, at a funeral she wasn't important enough to attend properly, her grandfather's funeral. Fu Jinghan had come. He had stood at the back of the hall in a dark coat, said nothing to anyone, and left before the reception began. Later, she'd heard a rumor that Jinghan Capital had quietly tried to buy a controlling stake in Lin Holdings within a year of her grandfather's death and had been turned away by her father, who called him an opportunist circling a corpse. She had thought nothing of it at the time. She had been too busy dying by then. It had taken her nearly 2 weeks of careful, quiet asking to even get this far, 2 weeks of cultivating the one relationship in that mansion she had never bothered to cultivate the first time she lived through it. Auntie Rong had worked for the Lin family for over 30 years, since before Xinyue was born, and had been the only person in that entire household who had ever looked at her with something resembling real affection rather than calculated interest. In her last life, Xinyue had been too consumed by her own slow unraveling to notice how much the old woman had quietly tried to protect her, an extra blanket left in her room during winter, a warm meal set aside when she'd been forced to skip dinner after some perceived slight against Meichi, a soft word muttered under her breath whenever Wang Shufan's voice grew too sharp. This time, Xinyue had made a point of noticing. Miss Xinyue, Auntie Rong had said one evening, over tea in the kitchen after the rest of the house had gone to bed, you've been asking a great many careful questions lately. About the master's old business dealings. About people I haven't heard mentioned in years. Should I stop? The old woman had studied her for a long moment, the kind of look that saw far more than anyone in that family ever gave her credit for. Your grandfather used to say the same thing to me, near the end, Auntie Rong had said quietly. That something in this house didn't add up. He asked me to remember names. Faces. Who came and went, and when. She had reached into her apron pocket and withdrawn a small folded card. A man came to the estate twice, about a year before your grandfather passed. Never came inside. Waited in the drive. Your grandfather met him alone, in the garden, both times. The card had borne a single name and a Hunyuan Tower address. Fu Jinghan. Xinyue had stared at it for a long moment before folding it carefully into her sleeve. Thank you, Auntie Rong. For remembering. Your grandfather trusted very few people at the end, the old woman had said. I don't know why he trusted this one. But he did. That single card was the reason she was standing outside this office now, straightening a blazer sleeve over fingers that refused to stop trembling no matter how many times she told herself she had rehearsed this moment enough. Now, she understood something her past self never had, Fu Jinghan hadn't been circling a corpse. He had been trying to save something. She knocked. Come in. The voice was low, unhurried, the voice of a man who had never needed to raise it to be obeyed. Xinyue stepped inside. The office was almost aggressively plain for someone who ran a firm managing this many billions, steel gray walls, no photographs, a single black and white print of a mountain range on one wall, and a desk with nothing on it except a laptop, a pen, and a folder turned face down. Fu Jinghan sat behind it, sleeves rolled to the forearm, a man perhaps 30 years old with the kind of stillness that made people in rooms with him feel they were the ones being watched. He didn't stand. Miss Lin. His eyes moved over her once, unreadable. I confess I'm curious. Your father called my office twice last year to warn people off doing business with me. Now his daughter walks in requesting a private meeting. My father doesn't know I'm here. I assumed as much. He gestured to the chair across from him. Sit. You have exactly enough of my time to explain why I shouldn't have you shown out. Xinyue sat. She kept her spine straight, her hands folded, and let silence stretch for exactly 3 seconds before she spoke, long enough to show she wasn't nervous, short enough not to seem like she was performing. You tried to acquire a stake in Lin Holdings 11 months after my grandfather's death. My father refused and told people you were an opportunist. I don't think that's true. Something flickered behind his eyes. Not quite surprise. More like recalibration. And what do you think is true? I think you knew something was wrong with the company's books before anyone else did. I think you tried to get inside so you could either fix it or expose it, and I think my father refused because letting you in would have meant letting someone see what he didn't want seen. Fu Jinghan leaned back slightly. That's an interesting theory. Do you have anything besides theories? This was the moment. Xinyue had spent 3 sleepless nights deciding exactly how much to reveal and exactly how to make it undeniable without confessing the truth, that she remembered a future no one else did. In 4 months, she said, Lin Holdings will announce a joint infrastructure bid with Qingwei Group for the Nanjiang Rail extension. The bid will look strong on paper. It will fail, not because the engineering numbers are wrong, but because 11 million yuan earmarked for the environmental compliance review will be missing from the account it was supposed to sit in. The board will blame a clerical error. It will not be a clerical error. She let that sit in the room. Fu Jinghan didn't move for a long moment. Then, very slowly, he turned his laptop screen toward himself and typed something. His eyes flicked once toward her. There's no public information about a Nanjiang rail bid, he said quietly. That project hasn't even been announced internally. I know. Then how do you know? Xinyue met his eyes without blinking. Because I've spent my whole life watching this family move money in and out of accounts they think no one is smart enough to notice. Call it instinct, if that's easier to accept. It wasn't the whole truth. It wasn't even close. But it was something he could hold in his hands without deciding she belonged in an asylum. Fu Jinghan studied her the way he might study a balance sheet with a number that didn't add up, not with suspicion exactly, but with the specific attention of a man who did not like unexplained variables. Suppose I believe you, he said finally. What do you want from me? 2 things. Xinyue held up a finger. First, you have the resources and the reach to trace money through shell accounts in ways I can't, not yet, not from inside that house. I need someone to quietly follow 7 names for me. I can't do it alone, and I can't trust anyone inside my own family to do it honestly. And second, she said, when the Nanjiang bid collapses in 4 months and my father starts looking for someone to blame, I want you positioned to be the one who steps in and picks up the pieces of Lin Holdings. Not as an opportunist. As the person who's already done the quiet work of understanding exactly how deep the rot goes. For the first time since she'd walked in, something like genuine interest crossed Fu Jinghan's face. You're asking me to help you destroy your own family. I'm asking you to help me stop them from destroying anyone else, Xinyue said. My grandfather built that company from a single textile factory. He didn't build it so his son could gut it to buy his daughter a custom emerald necklace. Something about the specificity of that detail made Fu Jinghan go very still. How do you know about the emerald necklace? Xinyue hadn't meant to say it. It had slipped out, a scar from another lifetime pressing through the careful mask she built. She recovered quickly. My sister doesn't hide anything from the household staff. And household staff don't hide much from me when I bother to ask. It was thin. She knew it was thin. But Fu Jinghan let it go, filing the inconsistency away rather than pressing it, the instinct of a man used to gathering pieces before assembling them into a picture. He was quiet for a moment, tapping the pen against the closed folder on his desk. I want to understand something first. Your father is not a subtle man. If you go after these 7 people and you're wrong about even one of them, you won't just fail, you'll hand him proof that you're unstable, unreliable, easy to have quietly removed from any position of influence in that family. Guardianship proceedings aren't unheard of for daughters who make accusations that don't hold up. I'm aware, Xinyue said. Which is exactly why I haven't gone to the police, or to a journalist, or to anyone who would demand answers before I have proof strong enough to survive being questioned. I came to you because you already have reason to believe something in that company is wrong, and because you have the resources to confirm it quietly, without exposing either of us before we're ready. You're very calm, Fu Jinghan observed, for someone describing her own family as an ongoing crime in progress. I've had a long time to get calm about it. You're 23. I've had a long time, she repeated, and something in the flatness of her voice made him stop pressing. He turned the folder on his desk over, finally, revealing several printed pages, shipping manifests, she realized after a moment, and construction permits. You should know I wasn't idle after your father turned me away 11 months after your grandfather's funeral, he said. I've had someone keeping a loose eye on Lin Holdings' public filings ever since. Nothing that would hold up in court. Suspicious patterns, mostly. Numbers that move in ways that don't match the business they're supposedly funding. He tapped one of the pages. This is the first time anyone's brought me something specific enough to act on. Then we want the same thing. We may want the same outcome, he said carefully. I'd be careful about assuming we want it for the same reasons. What's your reason? He considered the question longer than she expected. Your grandfather, he said finally, was one of the only people in this industry who ever built something instead of simply extracting value from something someone else had already built. I respected that. I don't respect what's happened to it since. Xinyue felt something in her chest loosen slightly, not trust, not yet, but the first thread of something that might eventually become it. Give me the 7 names, he said. Xinyue reached into her bag and withdrew a folded slip of paper. She had written it in code, dates instead of names, initials reversed, nothing that would mean anything to anyone except the two of them, in case it was ever found. Fu Jinghan unfolded it, read it once, and looked up. One of these is inside your own company's finance division. I know. I haven't confirmed who yet. That's part of what I need you for. He folded the paper again, slid it into the drawer of his desk, and locked it with a small brass key he wore on a chain beneath his shirt. I'll need 6 weeks. You have 4 months before Nanjiang collapses. Use whatever time you need before then. But Fu Jinghan, she paused, choosing her next words with care, I'm not doing this for money, and I'm not doing this for the company. I'm doing this because there is a debt in that family that's about to come due, and I intend to be the one collecting it. He studied her for a long moment, the mountain print behind him utterly still, the city outside the window sprawled out in gray afternoon light. You said 2 things you wanted, he said. You've named a company and a debt. You haven't told me why you're the one to collect it. Xinyue almost smiled. Almost. Because I already died once for this family's convenience, she said quietly. I don't intend to let it happen a second time, to me, or to anyone else they decide is expendable. She stood before he could ask what that meant. 6 weeks, she said. I'll be in touch. She left before he could see how much that sentence had cost her to say out loud. Fu Jinghan sat alone in his office long after the door closed. He didn't often meet with people he couldn't immediately categorize. Heiresses who wanted revenge on their families were not rare in his line of work. He turned away 3 just last year, each of them driven by petty spite dressed up as principal. Xinyue was different. There had been no performance in her voice when she spoke about the emerald necklace, no theater in the way her hands had gone briefly, involuntarily still at the word died. He opened the drawer, unfolded the coded slip of paper again, and studied the 7 entries. One inside Lin Holdings' finance division. If she was right about that, if she was right about any of it, then whatever had happened inside that family went far beyond greed. He picked up his phone and dialed a private investigator he trusted more than most of his own board members. I need everything you can find, he said, on a rail extension bid that, according to public records, doesn't exist yet. Xinyue rode the elevator down from the 40th floor alone, watching the numbers descend in slow, glowing red digits, and allowed herself, for the first time in 3 weeks, to simply breathe. She had done it. She had walked into a stranger's office and staked everything, her credibility, her safety, the fragile advantage of surprise she'd carried out of death itself, on the hope that a man she barely knew would choose to believe her instead of dismissing her as a bitter girl with a grudge. It wasn't trust, what had passed between them in that office. Not yet. But it was something adjacent to it, and after 3 years of being told, over and over, that she was worth less than a piece of jewelry, adjacent to trust felt almost indecently generous. She thought of her grandfather's letter, the one she hadn't found yet, though she would, in a matter of weeks, understand its exact wording as if she'd already read it 100 times, because the man who wrote it had loved her exactly the way she'd always hoped, quietly and without conditions, and some part of her seemed to already know that before she'd ever laid eyes on the page. She thought, too, of the 7 names now folded into a locked drawer 40 floors above her, and of the 11 million yuan that would go missing from an account no one else believed existed yet, and of a wedding 4 months away that she intended to burn to the ground before it could take anything else from her. The elevator doors opened onto the lobby, and Xinyue stepped out into the gray afternoon light, already rehearsing, in her mind, the version of herself she would need to be for dinner that evening, dutiful, quiet, patient, a girl with no secrets and no plans and no 7 names memorized in a code only 2 people in the world could read. She was getting better at that mask, each day. She wondered, sometimes, whether that should frighten her more than it did. It didn't. Not anymore. Some part of her understood, with a clarity that felt almost peaceful, that the mask was simply the price of the war, and she had already decided, the moment she woke up 23 years old with 3 years of memory no one else could see, that she was willing to pay whatever this cost. Fu Jinghan called her twice in the 6 weeks between their first meeting and the engagement ceremony, each time from a number she was instructed to save under a false name in her phone, Auntie Rose Taylor, an alias absurd enough that no one in her family would ever think to question it. Your compliance officer is Dang Wei, he told her during the second call, his voice flat with the particular satisfaction of a man who disliked loose ends. 41 years old, 1 daughter at university, a mortgage he's 3 months behind on. He's not a mastermind. He's a frightened man being used by people who understand exactly how to apply pressure to frightened men. Can he be turned? Possibly. Not yet. If we approach him too early, he panics and destroys evidence to protect himself. We need the Nanjiang shortfall to actually happen first, a real, undeniable gap in the books he can't quietly patch over on his own. Once that happens, his choices narrow considerably, and men with narrow choices tend to take the safest one available. And Han Deming? Careful. Meticulous. He's covered his tracks well on paper. Everything he's done has plausible legitimate justification, unless someone already knows to look for the lie underneath it. A pause. You said you're planning something at the Zhao engagement ceremony. I am. Whatever it is, Fu Jinghan said, make sure it doesn't move faster than the rest of this. A public scandal at the Zhao ceremony draws attention to your family generally. That's useful. But if it happens before we have the financial evidence secured, your father may panic and start destroying records before we can access them. I've thought about that, Xinyue said. I intend to make sure the ceremony scandal looks entirely separate from anything involving Lin Holdings' finances. Two unrelated crises are harder to connect than one obvious pattern. There was a brief silence on the line, the sound, she was beginning to recognize, of Fu Jinghan reconsidering someone's competence upward. That's good instinct, he said finally. Most people trying to bring down a family this size make the mistake of moving everything at once. You're pacing it. I've had practice pacing things, Xinyue said, and didn't elaborate further, and he, as he so often did, chose not to press. For days before the engagement ceremony, Xinyue requested a private tea with Zhao Yuchen, a request that scandalized her mother, who insisted proper young ladies did not seek out unsupervised meetings with their intendeds, and delighted her father, who saw in it evidence that his daughter understood, at last, how to secure a valuable arrangement. Neither of them understood what she was actually doing. She met Zhao Yuchen in a quiet tea house 2 streets from his family's estate, a place with private rooms and discreet staff who wouldn't gossip to their family about what was said inside them. He arrived looking exactly as she remembered him from the final months of her last life, too thin for a man his age, dark circles beneath his eyes that no amount of careful photography ever quite hid, a stillness to him that she now recognized wasn't calm so much as exhaustion. I confess I didn't expect this invitation, he said, settling across from her. Most women in your position avoid me until the ceremony makes avoidance impossible. I'm not most women. No, he said, studying her with quiet curiosity. I'm beginning to understand that. She poured the tea herself, an old habit she'd never quite unlearned even after 3 years married into a family that considered such gestures beneath her station. May I ask you something personal? You may ask. I reserve the right not to answer. Fair. She set the teapot down. How long have you known your heart condition was getting worse? Something in his expression shifted, surprise, first, and then a wariness she recognized instantly, the particular caution of a man who had learned the hard way not to discuss his own health too freely. 6 months, perhaps, he said slowly. Why do you ask? Because in 6 months, she said, choosing her words with the same care she'd used to defuse something that might otherwise explode in her hands, your family increased your medical consultations from once a week to twice. I'd imagine that means your doctor believes your condition is progressing faster than it should be, for something congenital and stable. Zhao Yuchen set his own cup down slowly. You've been asking about my medical history. I've been asking about a great many things, Xinyue said. Because I intend to survive this marriage, Zhao Yuchen, and I've learned recently that surviving anything in either of our families requires knowing exactly who benefits from our deaths before it becomes convenient for someone to arrange one. He went very still. That's a serious thing to say to a man you've met twice. It's a serious situation, she said. I don't know yet whether your uncle is responsible for what I suspect is happening to you. I intend to find out before our engagement ceremony, not after. And if I'm right, I intend to make sure it stops, publicly, so no quiet accident can finish what's already been started. For a long moment, Zhao Yuchen said nothing at all, turning his teacup slowly in his hands. My uncle inherits everything if I die before 30 without an heir, he said finally, quietly, as if saying it aloud for the first time. I've thought about it. I've told myself I was being paranoid. You weren't. You seem very certain, for someone with no evidence. I'll have evidence, Xinyue said, before the ceremony ends. I need you to trust me for exactly 30 seconds when the moment comes, and do exactly what I ask, without questioning it in front of 300 guests. He studied her for a long moment, the same careful, assembling look she would later recognize in someone else entirely, a man who weighed things fully before deciding whether they were safe to hold. All right, he said finally. 30 seconds. I suppose I have little enough to lose. You have more to lose than you think, Xinyue said gently. That's precisely the point. The Zhao family's mansion was lit up like a jewel box the night of the engagement ceremony. Red lanterns strung between the courtyard trees. A 12-piece orchestra positioned discreetly behind a folding silk screen. 300 guests in silk and tailored suits, all of them murmuring about the union between the Lin family's eldest daughter and Zhao Yuchen, heir to one of the country's oldest pharmaceutical fortunes. In her last life, Xinyue had walked into this exact courtyard in a red wedding dress and smiled through the entire ceremony because she had been told, over and over, that this marriage would save the Lin family from bankruptcy. It hadn't saved anyone. It had only cost her 3 years of her life and, eventually, all of it. This time, she wore red again, but she had chosen the dress herself, and beneath the embroidered sleeve, a small flash drive sat taped against her wrist, hidden by a wide jade bracelet. Zhao Yuchen stood beside her under the ceremonial arch, thinner than she remembered him being at 26, his complexion already carrying the faint gray undertone she recognized now with a clarity she hadn't possessed the first time she'd watched him slowly die across the hall of their shared mansion. She had once believed he'd simply been sickly from birth. She knew better now. "You look pale," she said quietly, while photographers adjusted lighting nearby. "Have you been feeling unwell again?" Zhao Yuchen's eyes flicked to her, surprised by the gentleness in her voice. No one at the ceremony had spoken to him as anything other than a fortune with a heartbeat attached. "The doctors say it's my heart," he said. "Congenital. Nothing to be done. Has it gotten worse in the last year?" He hesitated. "How did you know that?" Xinyue didn't answer directly. In her last life, she remembered the private physician, Dr. Song, who had visited Zhao Yuchen twice a week under the pretense of managing a congenital condition. She remembered, too late, finding a ledger showing medical consultation payments made not by the Zhao family, but by an account controlled by Zhao Yuchen's own uncle, a man who stood to inherit the pharmaceutical company's controlling shares should his sickly nephew fail to produce an heir before turning 30. She had learned all of it after Zhao Yuchen was already in the ground. This time, she intended to learn it before the ceremony ended. "I've arranged something," she said quietly, as the officiant began calling the hall to order. "When the toast is given, don't drink from your own cup. Trade it with mine." Zhao Yuchen frowned. "Why would?" "Trust me for 30 seconds, she said. "That's all I'm asking." The ceremony proceeded exactly as ceremonies like this always did, flowery speeches from both family patriarchs, a toast to prosperity and long life, cameras flashing to capture the future Mrs. Zhao raising her glass beside her intended. As the cups were raised, Xinyue smoothly exchanged hers with Zhao Yuchen's, the movement disguised as an affectionate gesture, her fingers lingering briefly over his in a way that made the photographers coo and lean in for a better shot. Zhao Yuchen's uncle, seated in the front row beside the elder Zhao patriarch, went very still. Xinyue watched him from the corner of her eye. It was the same look she'd learned to recognize in her own father's face the night the doctor asked about extending her treatment. Not concern. Calculation. She raised the cup to her lips and only pretended to drink, letting the liquid touch her mouth without swallowing, exactly as she'd practiced in the mirror the night before. Nothing happened, of course. Not yet. The compound Dr. Song had been slipping into Zhao Yuchen's heart medication for the past several months was slow-acting, cumulative, undetectable in a single dose. She remembered that much from the private autopsy report her own lawyer had once shown her, in another life, after it no longer mattered. But she had something else now. Something Fu Jingin's investigator had delivered to her 2 days ago in a plain envelope, bank transfer records showing Zhao Yuchen's uncle paying Dr. Song a monthly retainer nearly triple the standard consultation fee, routed through a shell company registered in his housekeeper's name. In the days leading up to the ceremony, Xinyue had rehearsed this moment more times than she could count, alone in her bedroom mirror at midnight, testing the exact tone of voice that would sound like concern rather than accusation, the exact pause that would let the courtyard's own imagination do half the damning work for her. She had learned, in 3 years of a marriage that eventually killed her, that timing mattered more than truth. A fact delivered too early could be buried. A fact delivered too late arrived only as grief. But a fact delivered at the precise moment her room was already primed to believe the worst of the people it half suspected all along. That fact became undeniable. She had one chance to use it, and this was it. As the applause for the toast died down and the officiant prepared to move to the next portion of the ceremony, Xinyue rose to her feet, still holding the untouched cup. "Before we continue," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the courtyard, "I'd like to say something, as the bride." 300 guests turned toward her. Her mother's smile froze in place. Her father's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Neither of them liked surprises they hadn't scripted. "Zhao Yuchen has been very open with me about his heart condition," Xinyue continued, projecting warmth even as her words became a blade. "He told me his doctor visits him twice a week to manage his medication. I think that's a beautiful thing, a family that cares enough to invest so heavily in one person's health." She let the words "invest so heavily" sit in the air a beat longer than necessary. "Which is why I found it strange," she went on, "that Dr. Song's monthly retainer is nearly 3 times the standard rate for cardiac consultation, and why it's paid not by the Zhao family patriarch, but through an account registered to a woman who happens to share a household address with Zhao Yuchen's uncle." A ripple moved through the crowd. Cameras that had been aimed lazily at the happy couple suddenly sharpened with attention. Zhao Yuchen turned to look at his uncle. The old patriarch's face had drained of color. I had these records verified independently, Xinyue said, nodding to a man standing quietly near the edge of the courtyard. One of Fu Jinyan's people, positioned there precisely for this moment, holding a tablet with the documents ready to display to anyone who asked. A private lab is currently testing a sample of Zhao Yuchen's most recent medication. I expect results within the week. I hope, sincerely, that I'm wrong. She turned to Zhao Yuchen's uncle directly. But if I'm not, she said, voice quiet now, almost gentle, then I think everyone here deserves to know why a man's heart medication has been quietly making him sicker for the better part of a year, and who benefits most from a nephew who never lives long enough to inherit. Wang Shufan's fan had snapped shut in her hand. Lin Guo's face had gone the particular shade of gray that Xinyue recognized from a hospital room in another lifetime, the color of a man watching a carefully constructed plan collapse in real time in front of people whose opinions mattered more to him than his own daughter's life ever had. Somewhere near the back of the courtyard, a photographer's shutter clicked rapidly, capturing frame after frame of a scandal unfolding in real time, and Xinyue understood, with a kind of distant clarity, that by morning this moment would exist in dozens of publications, immortalized from a dozen different angles, each one carrying the same essential truth she had just spoken aloud. The courtyard had gone utterly silent except for the distant orchestra, still playing, unaware that the room around it had frozen. Zhao Yuchen's uncle stood so abruptly his chair scraped loudly against the stone floor. "This is slander," he said, too loudly, too fast. "Baseless slander, on my own nephew's engagement night. Then the lab results will clear your name," Xinyue said evenly. "I look forward to it." Zhao Yuchen, pale and trembling, looked at his uncle with an expression Xinyue recognized from her own mirror 3 years into a marriage she'd only later understood had been designed to make her disappear quietly. It was the look of a person realizing, in real time, exactly how disposable he had been to the people who claimed to love him. The elder Zhao patriarch rose slowly from his seat, his eyes moving from his brother to his son to the young woman standing calmly amid the wreckage of a wedding that would never happen now. "Get him tested tonight," the patriarch said, his voice like stone. "And get my brother out of my house." By midnight, the engagement was formally called off. By morning, the story had reached every major business paper in the city, not because Xinyue had leaked it, but because 300 guests with 300 phones had needed no help spreading it themselves. Meichi found her in the breakfast room before either of their parents had woken, still scrolling through her phone with an expression Xinyue hadn't seen on her sister's face before, something almost like fear, dressed up poorly as annoyance. "Do you know how many messages I've gotten this morning?" Meichi said, dropping into the chair across from her. "People from my own friend group, asking if it's true our family tried to marry you off to a man who was being poisoned. Do you understand what this does to me? To my reputation." "I understand it's inconvenient for you," Xinyue said, buttering a piece of toast with a calm she didn't entirely feel. "I'm sorry it's landed on your morning instead of just mine." "That's not," Meichi stopped, some new and unfamiliar uncertainty crossing her face. "You don't even seem upset. Your engagement just fell apart in front of 300 people and you're eating breakfast like nothing happened." "My engagement was never something I wanted, Meichi. I'm not upset that it's over. I'm relieved." "Relieved?" Meichi stared at her. "Do you have any idea what father's going to say when he wakes up?" "I have a very good idea," Xinyue said. "I imagine he'll be angrier about the lost business connection than he ever would have been about me marrying a man who was actively being poisoned by his own family. That tells you something, doesn't it? About what this family actually values." Meichi opened her mouth to argue, then closed it again, something flickering behind her eyes that Xinyue hadn't seen there before, not quite doubt, not yet, but the first faint crack in a worldview that had never once been questioned. She said nothing further. She simply picked up her phone again and left the breakfast room without another word, and Xinyue understood, watching her go, that whatever had shifted in her sister that morning would take a very long time to become anything resembling real change. It would take, in fact, nearly 2 more years, and a courtroom, and a collapsed fashion brand, and a small boutique 2 districts away, before that first crack became anything Xinyue could recognize as genuine. Lin Xinyue found his daughter in the mansion's east garden just after dawn, still in her ceremonial dress, watching the sun rise over a house that no longer had a wedding to plan. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" His voice shook with barely restrained fury. "The Zhao family will never do business with us again. Do you understand what that engagement was for?" "I understand exactly what it was for," Xinyue said, without turning around. "It was for money. It was always only ever for money. It was for this family's survival." "No." She finally turned to face him, and something in her expression made her father take an involuntary step back. "It was for your survival, father. Not mine. Never mine." She walked past him, back toward the house, leaving him standing alone in the garden with the first light of morning and the first crack, however small, in the version of the world he had built for himself. Wang Shufan found her an hour later, in her bedroom, still in the ceremonial dress she hadn't yet had the heart to remove. "Do you understand what you've cost this family?" her mother demanded, her voice tight with a fury that had clearly been rehearsed in the mirror on the way up the stairs. The Zhao family will spread this story to every business partner we have left. No one will want to associate with the Lin name after this. The Zhao family is currently discovering that their own patriarch's brother has been poisoning his nephew for the better part of a year, Xinyue said, unclasping the ceremonial hairpins one by one with steady hands. I imagine they have somewhat larger concerns than gossiping about us, mother. You humiliated this family in front of 300 guests. I told the truth in front of 300 guests, Xinyue corrected. If that humiliates this family, perhaps it's worth asking what kind of family requires lies to maintain its dignity. Wang Shufan's hand rose sharply, and for one suspended moment Xinyue genuinely believed she intended to strike her. She didn't move. She didn't flinch. She simply watched her mother's hand hover in the air between them, and something in her utter stillness made Wang Shufan lower it slowly, uncertainly, as though she herself weren't sure why she'd stopped. You've changed, her mother said quietly, almost accusingly, as though it were a betrayal in itself. Yes, Xinyue agreed. I have. She didn't explain further. She simply turned back to the mirror and continued removing the hairpins, one by one, until her mother's footsteps retreated down the hallway and the door closed behind her, softer this time, uncertain in a way Xinyue had never once heard from her before. The brass key had come to her 3 days after the funeral, in her past life, tucked inside a letter her grandfather's lawyer had mailed too late for it to matter. By then, she had already signed away everything he'd left her, coerced by a family who told her the will was outdated and informal and needed to be corrected through documents they'd already prepared. This time, she intended to find the key before anyone had the chance to make her sign anything. She found it exactly where she remembered it, inside the false bottom of her grandfather's old writing desk, still sitting untouched in the study no one else in the family ever bothered to enter, because none of them had ever cared about the man who built their fortune once he'd stopped being useful to sign checks. The number stamped into the brass was small, but she remembered it as if it had been burned into her, 317. The study itself had barely changed since her grandfather's death. Her father, for all his cruelty, had never quite found the nerve to clear it out, as though some superstitious part of him feared what might be uncovered if he disturbed his father's things too thoroughly. Dust had settled over the leather-bound ledgers on the shelves. The old brass reading lamp still sat exactly where it always had, beside a chair no one but Xinyue had sat in for 3 years. She had come here twice before, in the weeks since her rebirth, each time under the pretense of missing him, a claim no one in her family bothered to question, since none of them wanted to spend enough time near their own guilt to wonder why she lingered there so long. It was on her 3rd visit, running her fingers along the underside of the writing desk exactly as she remembered doing once before, in a version of this timeline that no longer existed, that she felt the seam beneath the wood shift slightly under her touch. Her heart had pounded so loudly in that moment she'd been half certain someone in the hallway would hear it. She'd pressed her palm flat against the panel, urging it the last quarter inch it needed, and it had given way with a soft click that felt, in the silence of that empty study, louder than a gunshot. Inside, the small brass key, exactly where memory told her it would be, cool and unremarkable in her palm. No note. No explanation. Just a single number stamped into the metal, waiting for someone patient enough to come looking. She had slipped it into her sleeve and left the study without touching another thing, her pulse only slowing once she was 3 hallways away and certain no one had seen. It took 2 visits to 3 different private vault companies before she found the right one, a discreet institution on the quiet end of Jiangnan Road that didn't advertise, didn't take walk-ins, and required a secondary verification beyond the key alone. Full name in relationship to the box holder, the clerk said, sliding a form across the counter. Lin Xinyue. Granddaughter of Lin Xinyue. The clerk checked something on his screen, then nodded once. You're listed as an approved secondary holder. This way. She hadn't known that. Her grandfather had never told her. But of course he had planned for this. He had always been 3 steps ahead of everyone in that family, right up until the day his heart gave out at a company dinner. Nobody but Xinyue had actually noticed him leave early. The box, when it finally slid open in the private viewing room, was heavier than she expected. Inside, a leather folder, aged but carefully preserved. A small digital recorder, the kind used decades ago for voice memos. A sealed envelope with her name written on it in her grandfather's unmistakable, sharp handwriting. And beneath all of it, a thick stack of financial documents bound with a faded rubber band. She opened the envelope first. Xinyue. If you are reading this, it means something has gone wrong either with me, or with the family I built and, I fear, may have failed to protect you from. I have watched your father since he was a boy. I know what he is capable of when money is at stake, and I have watched your mother encourage the worst of it. I have loved them both as my children regardless, but love does not make me blind. This box contains my true will, executed and notarized 18 months before my death, not the version your father will present to you, which I have reason to believe he intends to alter the moment I am gone. It also contains recordings I made over the past 2 years, documenting conversations I was never meant to overhear, and financial records tracing money that has left this family in ways your father would prefer no one ever examine. I am sorry I could not protect you while I lived. I hope, in whatever way is left to me, that I can protect you now. You were always the only one of my grandchildren who understood that a fortune built on cruelty is worth nothing at all. I love you. I always have. Grandfather. Xinyue read the letter twice, then a third time, her hands trembling in a way that had nothing to do with strategy or plotting. In her last life, she had never known this letter existed. She had signed away her grandfather's true wishes without ever learning he had tried, in his own quiet way, to stop it from happening. She wiped her eyes, folded the letter carefully, and turned to the recorder. The first recording was dated nearly 2 years before her grandfather's death. His voice, older but familiar, filled the small viewing room, followed by a second voice she recognized immediately, her father's. The girl doesn't need to know the details. She'll sign whatever we put in front of her. She always does. And if she asks about the original will? There won't be an original will by the time this matters. Han Deming is handling it. Han Deming. The family lawyer. One of the 7 names. The second recording, dated 4 months later, was worse, her father and uncle discussing the Zhao marriage in terms that made her stomach turn even now, having lived through its consequences once already. 30 million is a generous bride price. More than she's worth, frankly. She'll do as she's told. She always does. And if she doesn't? Then we remind her what happens to daughters who embarrass this family. She's seen what happened to her cousin. She won't forget the lesson. Xinyue's hand had gone very still over the recorder at that. She had never known what had happened to her cousin, a girl she barely remembered, who had vanished from family gatherings sometime during her teenage years, dismissed always with a vague explanation about moving abroad for school. She made a note, mentally, to ask Auntie Rome about it, later, when she had the strength to hear whatever the answer turned out to be. The third recording was shorter, but colder, her uncle's voice this time, thinner and more anxious than her father's, discussing a debt of nearly 4 million yuan owed to men whose names he refused to say aloud even in what he clearly believed was a private conversation. I need it moved by Friday, or they'll come to the house. It'll come from the compliance reserve. No one audits that account until the project's finished, and by then it'll have been replenished twice over. And if someone does look, no one looks at money that's supposedly protecting the environment, Baoshan. It's the safest account in the entire company. It confirmed what she had suspected but never proven in her last life, her uncle's gambling debts, paid in installments from an account labeled, in the company's internal ledger, as Nanjiang Compliance Reserve, the same account that, in this timeline, was scheduled to come up 11 million yuan short in a matter of weeks, exactly as she had predicted to Fu Jinghan in his office on the 40th floor of a tower neither man in this recording knew existed as a threat yet. She sat in the small, windowless room for a long time after the last recording ended, the financial documents spread across the table in front of her, years of siphoned funds, forged signatures on shareholder documents, a paper trail leading directly back to Han Deming's office and, through him, to a compliance officer inside Lin Holdings' own finance division. The 7th name. Confirmed at last. She thought, as she sat there, of the cousin the recording had mentioned, the girl she barely remembered, who had vanished from family gatherings sometime during her teenage years. That evening, back at the mansion, she found Auntie Rong in the kitchen and asked, as gently as she could, what had happened to her. The old woman had gone quiet for a long moment before answering. Su Lan. Your father's brother's daughter, from his first marriage. A sweet girl. Quieter than you, if you can imagine it. She'd run the dish towel in her hands, an old nervous habit Xinyue had noticed before but never understood the source of. She refused an arranged match when she was 17. Said she wanted to finish school first, marry someone she chose herself. Your grandfather supported her, quietly. Your father did not. What happened to her? She was sent to a boarding school in Switzerland. That's the story the family tells. Auntie Rong had lowered her voice further. The truth, as I understand it from the driver who took her to the airport, is that she was placed somewhere far less pleasant than a boarding school, a private facility, the kind families use when they want a difficult relative to simply stop being difficult. I don't know if she's even still alive, Miss Xinyue. I've never dared ask. Xinyue had sat with that information for a long time after Auntie Rong retired for the evening, turning it over with a cold, careful fury she hadn't quite felt even at the news of her own death. It was one thing to have been sacrificed herself. It was another entirely to learn how many others had quietly disappeared before her, erased from family conversation as easily as an inconvenient debt. She added Su Lan's name to a new list, not the 7 names of the guilty, but a much shorter, much more urgent list of the missing, and resolved, before she slept that night, that finding her would be the very first thing she did once the trial was finally behind her. She gathered everything carefully, replaced it in the box exactly as she'd found it, and made 3 copies of every document before she left the building, one for herself, one delivered by courier to Fu Jinghan's office within the hour, and one placed, for safekeeping, in a bank deposit box registered under a name no one in the Lin family had ever heard of. That evening, Fu Jinghan called. I've had my people cross-reference everything you sent, he said without preamble. It's more than enough. Combined with what we already have on the Nanjiang account, this isn't just a family dispute anymore. This is fraud, forgery, and misappropriation of shareholder assets on a scale that will interest regulators as much as it interests the courtroom. Good, Xinyue said quietly. Because I don't just want them exposed, Fu Jinghan. I want them held accountable in front of everyone who ever believed the story my father told about himself. There was a brief pause on the line. You should know, Fu Jinghan said, once this becomes public, there's no controlling how far it spreads. Your mother. Your sister. People who may not have known the full extent of it will be dragged into scrutiny regardless. Xinyue thought of Meichi, checking her reflection in a hospital room while their sister lay dying 12 feet away, complaining about diamonds that were too small. My sister has spent her entire life benefiting from money she never once asked where it came from, Xinyue said. It's time she learned exactly what that cost, and who paid for it. Chapter 8, The Courtroom. Before the lawsuit was ever filed, there was a board meeting, the kind that never made the papers, held in a private conference room on the 30th floor of Lin Holdings headquarters, attended only by the company's independent directors, its outgoing chairman, and, for the first time, Xinyue herself, seated at the table not as a daughter but as the primary shareholder of record following her grandfather's true will. You're proposing to publicly destroy the reputation of the company that bears your family's name, one of the older directors said, his tone carrying the particular skepticism reserved for young women who had never before been taken seriously in that room. Have you considered the alternative? A quiet settlement. Your father resigns for health reasons. The fraud is corrected internally, without ever becoming public. I've considered it, Xinyue said. I rejected it. May I ask why? Because a quiet settlement protects the people who committed the fraud far more than it protects the people they defrauded, she said. Deng Wei falsified reports because he was afraid of losing his job. If this stays quiet, nothing changes for the next Deng Wei who's asked to do the same thing. My grandfather didn't build this company so it could keep operating exactly as corruptly as it has been, simply with better manners about it. Fu Jinghan, seated at the far end of the table as the firm's newly disclosed minority stakeholder, said nothing during this exchange, though Xinyue caught, once, the faintest suggestion of approval in the set of his jaw. And if the market punishes the company for the scandal regardless of how it's handled, the director pressed. Share price collapses. Investors flee. You could be chairwoman of a company worth a fraction of what it is today. Then I'll be chairwoman of a smaller company that's actually honest, Xinyue said, instead of a larger one built on lies I'd have to keep telling for the rest of my life to protect it. I'd rather rebuild something true than manage something false, however profitable the false version might be. The vote to support the fraud investigation and to formally distance the board from Lin Guowei's leadership pending the outcome passed 7-2. It was the last board meeting Lin Guowei ever attended as chairman. The lawsuit was filed on a gray Tuesday morning, and by Wednesday, it was the only story any business channel in the city wanted to cover. Lin Holdings Air files fraud suit against own father, alleges forged will, misappropriated funds, coerced marriage. Xinyue sat in the front row of the courtroom in a plain gray suit, no jewelry, hair pulled back, deliberately unremarkable, so that nothing about her appearance would distract from the evidence about to be laid bare in front of the room. Her father sat at the defense table beside Han Deming, both men's faces carrying the particular gray pallor of people who had believed, until very recently, that money could outrun consequences indefinitely. Her mother sat 2 rows behind him, refusing to meet Xinyue's eyes. Meichi sat beside their mother, still in a designer coat, though for the first time in her life it seemed to offer her no comfort at all. The prosecution, Fu Jing'an's legal team, working alongside a court-appointed fraud investigator, built its case methodically over 3 days. First, the true will, notarized and verified by an independent handwriting analyst, directly contradicting the version Lin Guowei had presented to the court 18 months prior as the family's final and only testament. Second, the recordings, played aloud in open court, her grandfather's voice and her father's voice filling a silent room while reporters in the gallery took notes so fast their pens nearly tore the paper. There won't be an original will by the time this matters. Han Deming is handling it. Han Deming's lawyer objected 6 times during that recording. The judge overruled him each time. Third, the financial trail, 30 million yuan in bride price funneled not toward the company's survival, as the family had always claimed, but into a luxury fashion brand, a string of gambling debts, and, most damning of all, an account labeled Nanjiang Compliance Reserve that had, exactly as Xinyue predicted months earlier, come up 11 million yuan short during an internal audit the week before the trial began, an audit Fu Jing'an's firm had quietly insisted on, once his acquisition. Talks with the board had finally, formally begun. Han Deming's cross-examination of Xinyue herself, on the second day, was the closest the defense came to landing a real blow. Miss Lin, he said, pacing slowly in front of the witness stand, you'd have this court believe you uncovered a multi-year conspiracy through nothing more than instinct and a lucky guess about a rail project that hadn't yet been announced. Isn't it more likely that someone provided you with inside information you're now unwilling to disclose the source of? I've disclosed every document, recording, and financial record relevant to this case, Xinyue said evenly. The source of my initial suspicion isn't relevant to whether the evidence itself is genuine. It's relevant to your credibility. My credibility isn't the one in question, Mr. Deming. Yours is being decided based on a recording of your own voice, discussing the destruction of my grandfather's original will 18 months before his death actually occurred. I'd suggest that's rather more relevant to this proceeding than how I came to suspect it. A ripple of quiet laughter moved through the gallery. The judge rapped once for order, though not, Xinyue noticed, without the faint suggestion of a smile of her own. Han Deming tried a different angle. You've admitted you sought out Fu Jinghan, a man actively attempting to acquire your family's company, before bringing any of this to the authorities. Isn't it true that this entire proceeding benefits him more than it benefits justice? It benefits whoever ends up telling the truth in this room, Xinyue said. If that happens to also benefit Mr. Fu, I'd suggest that's because he was the only person willing to help me uncover it, not because the truth itself is somehow less true for being inconvenient to my father. The defense had no further questions after that. During the trial's second recess, Lin Xinyue approached his daughter in a quiet corridor away from the reporters, his composure fraying at the edges for the first time since the proceedings began. You could end this, he said, his voice low and urgent. Withdraw the suit. Say the evidence was inconclusive. I'll sign over the Nanjiang shares to you directly, no strings, more than you'd ever get from a court settlement. We could still fix this, Xinyue. There's nothing left to fix, father. There's only what's true and what isn't. Everything I did, he said, and for a moment something almost like genuine anguish crossed his face, I did to keep this family afloat. You have no idea what it's like to carry a company on your shoulders, to make impossible choices. I know exactly what it's like to be the impossible choice, Xinyue said quietly. I was in a hospital bed once, dying, while you decided whether continuing my treatment was worth the expense. I watched you sign a form ending my life without so much as glancing at what it said. Don't stand here and tell me about impossible choices, father. You've never once made one that cost you anything you actually valued. His face went pale. What are you talking about? You've never been hospitalized in your life. She hadn't meant to say it, hadn't meant to let a memory from a life he'd never lived slip past the careful boundaries she'd maintained for months. She recovered quickly, the way she always did now, folding the slip back into calm. I'm talking about every version of a daughter you've ever been willing to sacrifice for convenience, she said. There's always been one, father. You've simply never had to watch what happens to her afterward. I have. She left him standing in the corridor, his composure gone entirely now, and did not look back to see whether he understood any part of what she just told him. Deng Wei's testimony, delivered on the third day under the terms of his plea agreement, was quieter than either of the dramatic recordings but somehow more devastating for its plainness, a tired, unremarkable man in his 40s describing, in flat administrative language, exactly how easy it had been to falsify a compliance reserve once someone above him made clear that questioning it would cost him his position. Did you ever consider reporting it? The prosecutor asked. Every year, Deng Wei said. And every year, Mr. Han reminded me my daughter's university tuition was due, and that a compliance officer with a fraud allegation on his record doesn't find easy employment elsewhere. He looked, briefly, toward Xinyue in the gallery. I'm not asking anyone to feel sorry for me. I made a choice, and I benefited from it for 3 years before I stopped being able to live with it. I'm only glad someone finally forced the choice back into the open. The seventh name, a compliance officer named Deng Wei, working inside Lin Holdings' finance division, testified under a plea agreement, describing in flat, exhausted detail how he'd falsified reserve reports for 3 years under direct instruction from Han Deming, in exchange for a steadily increasing salary he told himself, for a long time, was simply generous. By the fourth day, Lin Guo's legal team had stopped presenting a defense and started negotiating a plea. That evening, outside the courthouse, Xinyue found herself surrounded by more reporters than she'd ever faced at once, their questions overlapping into a single wall of noise. Miss Lin, do you have any regrets about what this means for your family's name? Miss Lin, is it true your grandfather predicted this exact outcome before his death? Miss Lin, some are calling you the most ruthless heiress in the city's history. How do you respond to that? She stopped at the edge of the steps and let the noise settle for a moment before she answered, choosing that last question deliberately. I'd say ruthlessness is an interesting word to use for a woman asking a court to enforce the truth, she said, her voice calm and carrying easily over the crowd. My grandfather built this company with his own hands, and he was defrauded and betrayed by the very people who inherited it. If demanding accountability for that is ruthless, then I'd ask what word you'd use to describe the people who forged his will, poisoned an innocent man for money, and sold his granddaughter into a marriage designed to make her disappear quietly. I don't think ruthless begins to cover it. She walked past them without waiting for a follow-up question, Fu Jing'an's driver already holding the car door open at the curb, and did not look back at the flashing cameras behind her. It didn't help her father, in the end. The story dominated every business channel for the full 5 days of the trial. Analysts who had spent years praising Lin Guo's steady leadership scrambled to revise their assessments in real time. A financial columnist who had once written an admiring profile of the Lin family's old world values published a follow-up piece with the headline "The values were never old world, they were just well hidden," a phrase that would follow Lin Xinyue for the rest of his public life. Shareholders, initially panicked, began to steady once Fu Jinyan's firm issued a joint statement with the board confirming its intention to stabilize the company through the transition, a statement Xinyue had reviewed and approved personally, insisting on language that made clear the fraud, not the company itself, was the source of the crisis. Employees inside Lin Holdings, she would learn much later, had watched the proceedings with a complicated mixture of vindication and anxiety. Vindication, because many of them had long suspected something was wrong with how certain accounts were managed. Anxiety, because scandal of this size rarely left ordinary jobs untouched. She made a point, in her very first address as chairwoman, of reassuring them directly, no layoffs tied to the restructuring, full transparency going forward, and an anonymous reporting line for any employee who noticed something that didn't add up. It was, she told herself privately, the least she owed to every quiet, frightened version of Dang Wei still working somewhere inside that building. The judge's ruling, delivered on the fifth day to a courtroom packed with reporters and shareholders alike, was unambiguous: forgery of testamentary documents, misappropriation of corporate funds, coercion related to the arranged marriage, and conspiracy, charges that would see Lin Xinyue, Han Deming, and Dang Wei each face significant prison sentences, and that stripped Lin Xinyue of his position as chairman of Lin Holdings effective immediately. Wang Shufan was not charged criminally. The recordings, damning as they were toward her husband, contained little direct evidence of her own hand in the fraud itself, but the civil judgment that followed ordered the family to return a portion of misappropriated assets, a ruling that would leave the family's remaining fortune a fraction of what it once was. Meichi sat through the entire final day of proceedings in silence, her phone, for once, nowhere in sight. Afterward, in the marble hallway outside the courtroom, she caught up to Xinyue before she could leave. "Did you know," Meichi said, her voice unsteady in a way Xinyue had never once heard from her sister, "that the money for my brand came from that account? Did you know before you filed this?" "Yes." Meichi's face crumpled. "You could have told me." Quietly. "Before all of this became a headline." "I could have," Xinyue agreed. "But you never once asked where anything came from, Meichi. Not the necklace. Not the brand. Not the shopping trips you never had to think twice about. You built your entire life on money you never questioned, and now you're asking me why I didn't protect you from the truth of where it came from. That's not fair." "No," Xinyue said quietly. "It wasn't fair when I spent months in a hospital bed and you complained that I looked old. It wasn't fair when father presented my work as his own and no one even said my name. Fairness was never something this family believed in, Meichi. I'm simply the first one who stopped pretending otherwise." She left her sister standing in the marble hallway, the first time in either of their lives that Meichi had nothing left to say. The Lin family mansion was sold 8 months later, the proceeds absorbed almost entirely by court-ordered restitution and the mounting legal fees of a defense that had never had a real chance of succeeding. Lin Xinyue began a 7-year sentence in a low-security facility 2 hours outside the city. Han Deming received 9 years. Dang Wei, having cooperated, received 18 months and the quiet, permanent end of his career. Wang Shufan moved into a modest apartment on the city's outskirts, the emerald necklace long since seized as part of the asset recovery. Meichi's fashion brand collapsed within the year, its funding source publicly exposed and its remaining investors fleeing before the scandal could touch them. Xinyue heard, secondhand, that her sister had taken a job, an actual job, for the first time in her life at a small boutique 2 districts away from anywhere their family name still meant anything. She felt, when she heard it, something quieter than triumph. Not forgiveness. Not yet, and perhaps not ever. But something adjacent to peace. Lin Holdings itself did not collapse. Under the terms negotiated during the restructuring, terms Xinyue herself had insisted on during closed-door board sessions, Fu Jinyan's firm acquired a significant but non-controlling stake, providing the capital injection needed to stabilize the company through the scandal. The board, in a vote that surprised no one who had watched the trial closely, elected Xinyue as the company's new chairwoman, her grandfather's granddaughter, the one who had uncovered the fraud rather than perpetuated it, the only member of the family whose name the market still trusted. The search for Su Lan took 4 months and nearly all of Fu Jinyan's investigators' patience, but it ended, eventually, at a private psychiatric facility 3 provinces away, a place that had, on paper, treated her for a nervous condition for nearly 6 years, and had, in reality, simply kept her sedated and compliant for the crime of wanting a life she'd chosen herself. Xinyue drove there personally the day the paperwork for her release finally cleared, and found a woman in her mid-20s who looked, disconcertingly, like a faded photograph of herself, hollowed out in the particular way of someone who had stopped expecting anyone to come looking. "You don't know me," Xinyue said gently, sitting across from her in a visiting room that smelled faintly of antiseptic, an echo of another room in another life she tried not to think about too closely. "But I'm your cousin, and I've come to take you home. Not to the Lin house. Somewhere new. Somewhere no one can send you away again." It took Su Lan a long time to believe her. It took longer still for her to speak more than a few words at a sitting, or to sleep through a night without waking in a panic at some remembered cruelty. But she recovered, slowly, the way people recover from things that should never have happened to them in the first place, one small trust rebuilt at a time, and within a year, she had taken a position at the Lin Xinyue Foundation herself, working directly with young women whose stories mirrored her own more closely than either of them liked to admit out loud. Your grandfather tried to stop it, Su Lan told her once, months into her recovery. I remember that much, even through everything after. He came to see me, the week before they sent me away. He told me he was going to fix it. I don't think he ever got the chance. He did fix it, Xinyue said quietly. It just took a little longer than either of us wanted. Within her first year as chairwoman, she established the Lin Xinyue Foundation named for her grandfather, funded by a portion of her own salary and a percentage of the company's annual profits, dedicated to supporting young women trapped in coerced or arranged marriages, providing legal aid, emergency housing, and the kind of quiet, practical help that no one had ever offered her the first time she needed it. Zhao Yuchen, recovering slowly under proper medical care once his uncle's interference was removed and his true prognosis reassessed by independent doctors, became one of the foundation's earliest and most generous donors. He and Xinyue remained close, in the particular way of two people who had once nearly been forced into a marriage neither of them wanted and had instead built something far more honest, a friendship neither expected, and both valued more than they'd expected to. You saved my life, he told her once, at the foundation's first annual gala, watching the room fill with women whose stories bore an uncomfortable resemblance to his own. I don't think I've ever properly said that. You saved yourself, Xinyue said. I only made sure you had the chance to. Semantics, not really. She smiled, watching a young woman across the room laugh freely for what her intake file said was likely the first time in over a year. The chance is the only thing anyone can really give another person. What they do with it is always theirs. Meichi's transformation was slower, and far less complete than Xinyue might once have hoped for, in the version of herself that still occasionally wished, uselessly, for a sister who actually loved her. She did not become a different person overnight. She did not weep with gratitude or beg forgiveness in any of the ways that might have made for a satisfying resolution. She simply, slowly, began to work, folding clothes at the small boutique 2 districts away, learning for the first time in her life what it felt like to earn something rather than simply expect it. Xinyue heard, through Auntie Rong, who still visited occasionally and still, impossibly, kept in touch with both sisters, that Meichi had begun sending a small portion of her modest wages to their mother each month, an act of quiet responsibility that would have been unthinkable in the woman who once complained about diamonds being too small beside her dying sister's hospital bed. Xinyue didn't visit. Not yet. Some wounds, she had come to understand, healed only with distance and time, and she was no longer interested in forcing reconciliation before either of them was ready for it to be genuine. She kept her grandfather's old writing desk in her new office, false bottom and all, though there was nothing left inside it now except an empty brass key on a chain she wore, most days, beneath her blouse. Fu Jinghan became something else entirely. It happened slowly, the way most true things did, not in a single dramatic moment, but across 100 small ones. Late nights reviewing board documents together long after his own staff had gone home. A birthday she hadn't mentioned to anyone, remembered anyway, marked with nothing more than a single, perfectly chosen book left on her desk. The particular quiet of his presence in her room, which she had once found unreadable and had slowly come to find, instead, restful. It had started, if she was honest with herself, on the night the verdict came down, the two of them sitting in his office long after the reporters had stopped calling, saying very little, simply existing in the same quiet room together because neither of them wanted to be the one who suggested going home first. You did something rare today, he'd said finally, watching her from across his desk, the mountain print behind him catching the last of the evening light. Most people who get what they want stop being interesting the moment they get it. You're not most people. Is that a compliment? It's an observation. He'd studied her for a long moment. Are you happy? Now that it's done? She considered the question honestly, for the first time letting herself feel the full weight of the answer rather than simply deciding what it should be. Not yet, she'd admitted. I think I will be. Eventually. Right now I mostly just feel light. Like I've been carrying something for years and finally set it down. That's not nothing. No, she'd agreed. It's not nothing at all. He'd walked her to her car that night, an unremarkable gesture that had somehow felt significant in a way she couldn't quite name, and it was only weeks later, watching him field a difficult board meeting with the same unhurried patience he'd shown her the very first day she'd walked into his office, that she understood the feeling had a much simpler name than she'd been willing to give it. You never did explain, he said one evening, nearly 2 years after their first meeting, as they stood together on the balcony of Lin Holdings' newly renovated headquarters, the city spread out beneath them in 1,000 small lights, how you knew about the Nanjiang account before it existed publicly. Or the emerald necklace. Or any of it. Xinyue looked out over the skyline for a long moment before she answered. Would you believe me, she said quietly, if I told you I've lived through all of it once already? Fu Jinghan considered her, the same careful, assembling attention he'd given her the first day she walked into his office. I think, he said slowly, that I've learned not to dismiss anything you tell me, however impossible it sounds. She smiled, a real smile, not the calculated one she'd practiced in a mirror the morning she woke up 23 years old with 3 years of memories no one else could see. Someday, she said, I'll tell you everything. Tonight, I'd rather just stand here. He didn't press. He simply reached over and took her hand, and for the first time since she'd opened her eyes in a life she'd already lost once, Xinyue let herself simply exist in a moment without calculating what it would cost her. It was nearly a year later, on a quiet evening with no cameras and no board members and nothing at stake except two people who had built something honest between them out of the wreckage of everything dishonest that came before, that Fu Jinghan asked her to marry him. He did it without ceremony, without an audience, without a single one of the calculated flourishes that had characterized every major event of her previous engagement. They were simply standing in his kitchen, a kitchen he rarely used, in an apartment he rarely spent time in, because he had spent most of the past 2 years, she'd come to realize, quietly making sure his own life had room in it for hers, and he set down the tea he'd been making and said, with the same unhurried directness he brought to everything else, I'd like to marry you. Not because it would be strategically advantageous, and not because either family expects it. Only because I can't think of a single version of my future that doesn't have you in the middle of it, and I'd like to make that official, if you're willing. Xinyue had laughed, a startled, genuine laugh, nothing like the practiced smile she'd once perfected in a mirror. That might be the least romantic proposal I've ever heard. I can try again, if you'd like something more theatrical. No, she said, crossing the kitchen to him. I think I've had quite enough theater to last several lifetimes. This is exactly right. Their wedding, held 8 months later in a small garden ceremony with no more than 60 guests, bore almost no resemblance to the engagement ceremony that had once nearly bound her to a marriage designed to make her disappear. Zhao Yuchen gave a toast. Auntie Rong cried through most of the ceremony, insisting loudly to anyone nearby that she had always known, from the very first strange questions Xinyue had begun asking 2 years earlier, that something remarkable was coming for that girl. Su Lan stood as one of 2 witnesses, alongside a Foundation client whose name Xinyue had once only known from an intake file and now considered, without qualification, a friend. Meichi was not invited, though she sent, through Auntie Rong, a small handwritten card that read simply, I hope you're happy. I mean that, even if I have no right to say it. Xinyue kept the card in a drawer for a long time before she finally, quietly, decided to write back. On the anniversary of her grandfather's death, Xinyue visited his grave alone, as she did every year, carrying a single bouquet of white chrysanthemums and the same worn book of poetry that had once hidden her list of 7 names. She knelt at the headstone and brushed away a season's worth of fallen leaves. I found your letter, she said quietly, as she always did. I found everything you left for me. I hope you know I used it exactly the way you would have wanted, not for revenge alone, though I won't pretend that wasn't part of it. For everyone else, too. For every girl who's ever been told her life is worth less than someone else's convenience. The wind moved gently through the cemetery's old pine trees. The company is safe now, she continued. Better than safe. It's becoming something you would have been proud of, I think, something that helps people instead of using them. She paused, her fingers tracing the carved characters of his name. And I'm happy, grandfather. For the first time in either of my lives, I think I actually am. She thought, standing there, of the girl who had lain in a hospital bed 3 years into a marriage no one had asked her whether she wanted, listening to her own mother explain, in a whisper meant to sound almost gentle, why sacrificing her had simply made sense. She thought of every birthday skipped, every achievement stolen, every quiet cruelty she had once mistaken for the ordinary texture of family life because she had never known anything else to compare it to.